Hello, class, and welcome to This Week in Forensic Psychology. My name is Dr. Neil Soggie, and I am your instructor for this course. This week, we're going to be diving into the fascinating world of psychological autopsies. Now, before we dive into the material, I want to acknowledge that this topic can be sensitive and may evoke some fairly strong feelings. So I want you to, if you feel the need to take a break, please feel free to do so, because we're going to be dealing with some difficult issues of life events and mental health history and societal pressures that are involved in what is behind why people die. And so be prepared for that. This topic will be a complex one, and in today's lecture, as always, I'm going to tell a little story about a key figure, and then we're going to dive into three main themes. The first theme is focusing on what the methodology and application of psychological autopsies is. And by that, I mean that we're going to examine the systematic approach that is really required to gather and analyze and interpret all the multiple sources of information that are needed to reconstruct the psychological state of someone who has died. And this includes exploring the different types of information that we utilize, such as interviews and medical records and personal writings, and to try to understand how these data points are corroborated to form a fairly cohesive narrative. We'll look at some of the steps, what are some of the challenges with reliability and validity, and how we can apply this to the real world. We'll then dive into the second theme here, which is ethical and legal considerations surrounding psychological autopsies. Now, of course, given the sensitive nature of these investigations, it's really crucial that we navigate the ethical dilemmas that are going to arise here, particularly concerning issues of confidentiality and consent and potential impact on surviving family members. And so there's some key questions here. What kinds of ethical guidelines should be used with psychological autopsies? How do we balance the need for thorough investigation, but also give respect for the deceased and their family? And what are the legal standards used in psychological autopsies? And then we'll take a look at some case analysis. We'll dive into some real and some hypothetical cases to see how psychological autopsies are applied in practice. And hopefully this will illustrate a little bit of the process and highlight the impact of psychological autopsies on understanding ambiguous deaths, such as those involving suspected suicides or homicides or accidents. So as always, I want to start with a story. And our story today is about an influential figure in the field of psychological autopsies, Dr. Edwin Schneidman. He was born in 1918 in York, Pennsylvania, and raised by a family that really kind of valued education and intellectual curiosity. He did his undergraduate studies at UCLA in California, earned his bachelor's degree in 1940, and went on to do his master's in 1942. Dr. Schneidman, in his career in psychology, began really during World War II when he served as a clinical psychologist for the U.S. Army Air Force. And after the war, he went into academia and was really kind of fascinated by the whole issue of suicide, and that kind of became the central theme of his research. And in 1958, he co-founded the Los Angeles Suicide Prevention Center, which is really one of the first of its kind in the United States. And it was a platform for studying suicide in depth to really kind of understand what went into it so that they could develop some prevention and intervention strategies. And one of Schneidman's most significant contributions to forensic psychology was developed during this time: the psychological autopsy. He's really recognized for understanding the psychological state of individuals prior to their deaths, especially in cases of suicide, and understanding that this is crucial for both clinical and legal purposes. Really, the psychological autopsy, as it's conceptualized by Schneidman, really involves detailed reconstruction of the deceased person's life, including their mental state, their behaviors, their relationships, and any stressors that they may have faced. And so it strives to be a systemic method that investigates death and what caused the death. And so when we think of Schneidman and kind of his way of thinking, one of the things he's best known for is something known as psych-ache, which he describes as really unbearable psychological pain. And he argued that this pain, rather than a desire for death itself, was the primary motivator for suicide. And his work on psych-ache has been influential in both clinical and forensic settings, helping professionals better understand the emotional experiences that lead individuals to take their own lives. Now, Schneidman was a prolific author, and he wrote numerous books about suicide. You see one of them on the slides there. He also wrote The Definition of Suicide in 1985 and The Voices of Death in 1980. And his work has become a bit of a cornerstone for understanding suicide. Now, Schneidman died back in 2009, but really his legacy does endure in forensic psychology. He did this pioneering work, and his legacy continues in psychological autopsies because they really become the standard for death investigations, helping to clarify ambiguous causes of death and to help provide closure for families. So, we're going to dive in a little bit into his work here because that really kind of forms the foundation of what we're going to be talking about in this class. So, what is a psychological autopsy? It's really a post-mortem investigation procedure that's aimed at reconstructing the psychological state of an individual prior to their death. So, unlike a traditional autopsy, which focuses on the physical causes of death, the psychological autopsy seeks to understand the deceased's mental and emotional condition. And so this is going to involve gathering information from a lot of different sources, the personal writings, interviewing family and friends, medical records, and any other relevant data that can be provided that provide some insight into the deceased's life. And the primary purpose of a psychological autopsy is to determine the psychological factors that may have contributed to an individual's death. And this is particularly important in cases where the cause of death is ambiguous, such as in suspected suicides or accidental deaths, or causes where there is a possibility of foul play. So by examining the psychological landscape of the deceased, investigators can make informed determinations about whether the death was self-inflicted, accidental, or the result of another person's actions. Now, the concept of the psychological autopsy does extend back to the mid-20th century with Dr. Edwin Schneidman, being one of the foremost figures in its development. And as we've already discussed, he recognized the need for a systematic approach to understanding suicides, especially in cases where the motivation behind the act was unclear. And through his work with the Los Angeles Suicide Prevention Center, he really kind of laid that groundwork for the methodologies used in psychological autopsies today. And one of the earliest and most influential cases in the development of psychological autopsies was the investigation into the death of a very famous lady that you may have heard of, Marilyn Monroe, in 1962. Monroe's death was ruled a probable suicide, but the ambiguity surrounding the circumstances led to the use of psychological autopsy techniques to analyze her mental state and her possible motives. And this case highlighted the importance of psychological autopsies in providing a deep understanding of high-profile and complex deaths. Over the years, psychological autopsies have been used in a number of cases: suicides, homicides, accidental deaths, and even cases of suspected terrorism. And in each case, it has contributed and has helped to refine the methods and expand the scope of psychological autopsies, making them now a fairly indispensable tool in forensic psychology. So when we talk about psychological autopsies, we need to recognize that they play a crucial role in the overall battery of things that can be done with forensic investigations, particularly when the cause and manner of death are not immediately apparent. And in such cases, the psychological autopsy can help clarify whether the death is a result of suicide, an accident, or a homicide. So, for instance, in suicide investigations, understanding the deceased's mental health state, recent life stressors, and social context can provide essential insights that might not be evident for a physical examination alone. Moreover, psychological autopsies are often used in legal context to inform court proceedings. And the findings from a psychological autopsy can be presented as evidence in cases involving things like wrongful death claims or criminal prosecutions and insurance disputes. And this whole process helps to provide a comprehensive picture of the deceased's state of mind, which can be crucial in determining liability or intent. In addition to their use in individual cases, though, psychological autopsies also contribute to broader public health initiatives by identifying risk factors for suicide and for forms of premature death. And so this helps to inform suicide prevention programs, mental health interventions, and policy decisions aimed at reducing the incidence of self-harm and destructive behavior within individuals, all of which I think we can agree is very important within society. Now, given the sensitive nature of these investigations, as I mentioned, it's very important that we take some time and really consider some complex issues around confidentiality and consent and the differences between psychological autopsies and clinical assessments. Because psychological autopsies are going to often intersect with legal processes, making it essential for forensic psychologists to be aware of the legal frameworks governing their practice. So first off, we can consider the whole admissibility in court, because the findings of a psychological autopsy can be presented as evidence in legal proceedings such as criminal trials, civil suits, wrongful death claims, insurance disputes, that sort of thing. However, the admissibility of these findings depends on several factors, including the qualifications of the psychologist, the methodologies used, and the relevance of the findings to the case. And the court has the right to scrutinize the scientific validity and reliability of the psychological autopsy. So it's crucial that they adhere to established protocols and evidence-based methods in conducting their investigation. There's also going to be some reliability issues because if the finding of the psychological autopsies are challenged or misinterpreted, the psychologist may face legal consequences, such as being sued for malpractice or defamation. And so it's essential to document the process meticulously, and this ensures that all findings are supported by credible evidence. There are also various legal standards and guidelines that exist to regulate the practice of psychological autopsies, and that's going to vary within the jurisdictions. You're going to need to do a little bit of work into the rules regarding preservation of evidence, the protection of privacy, and the maintenance of professional integrity. But when conducting the psychological autopsy, there's also a couple of other things that we need to be mindful of regarding the rights and dignity of the deceased, and balancing that with the surviving family members. Confidentiality is really kind of one of the cornerstones of ethical challenges in psychological autopsies. And it's a challenge because you want to maintain confidentiality. The deceased medical records, their personal writings, and other private information are often examined during the investigation. And while these are crucial for understanding the deceased's psychological state, there is an ethical obligation to protect the deceased's privacy. So in some cases, family members may not consent to the release of certain information, and this is going to create a conflict between the need for comprehensive data and the ethical duty to respect the family's wishes. And so as forensic psychologists will need to, of course, navigate that and seek some legal counsel in those regards. There's also the issue that, unlike clinical assessments that are really conducted with living individuals, psychological autopsies are performed after death. And this raises some unique consent issues. While the deceased cannot provide consent, it is common practice to seek consent from the next of kin or the legal representatives. However, this can become complicated, as I've already mentioned, if there are disagreements among family members, or if the deceased left specific instructions regarding the handling of their personal information. So the forensic psychologist needs to be transparent about the purpose of the psychological autopsy and to maintain informed consent from those legally entitled to provide it. And if the consent can't be granted, then the psychologist is really going to have to weigh the ethical implications of proceeding with an investigation with only part of the picture. And then there's the balancing of the different stakeholders. The deceased's family, insurance companies, law enforcement agencies, all of them have differing interests, and that is going to create an ethical tension. For example, the family member might be seeking closure while legal entities might be focused on establishing liability. And it's the responsibility of the forensic psychologist to balance these interests while maintaining objectivity. So there are differences in purpose between psychological autopsies and clinical assessments. A psychological autopsy is conducted to understand the psychological state of someone who has died. And it's often in that very ambiguous context. And this is very different from a clinical assessment that's performed to diagnose and treat a mental issue with someone that's living. The methodology is also different. A psychological autopsy relies on retrospective data collection. This might be interviews with those that knew the deceased. It might be review of personal documents. It might be analysis of medical or psychiatric records. And the aim here is to reconstruct the deceased states of mind and identify potential contributing factors to the death. That's very different from a clinical assessment that involves direct interaction with the person, giving psychological tests, interviews, and observations. So there's some ethical standards that we need to hold to in both psychological autopsies and clinical assessments, but they differ. In psychological autopsies, the primary ethical concern is respecting the deceased's privacy and the family's rights, while in the clinical assessment, the focus is on the individual's autonomy and confidentiality and informed consent. So, how do we do a psychological autopsy? Well, it does really require a multidisciplinary approach. It combines forensic psychology, as well as being informed about psychiatry, as well as being informed about sociology, and being informed about investigative procedures. And the whole goal is to reconstruct the deceased's mental state by systematically gathering and analyzing data from these multiple sources. So the first thing that we need to do, of course, is to conduct a thorough review of the case. And this includes examining all available records related to the deceased, such as medical and psychiatric and legal documents. And the case review provides a baseline understanding of the individual's life, their health history, and circumstances surrounding the death. Then we go into data collection, which is, once you've reviewed the case, you go out and try to get as much data, other data, as you can. And this might involve gathering information from a variety of sources to try to piece together the psychological profile of the deceased. Of course, I've already mentioned several times the main sources of data. You want to go talk to people, you want to review medical records, you want to review anything that they have written, their digital footprint, that sort of thing. You want to look at their relationships. That's a key thing. You want to look at their employment status. That's a thing. Each of these sources provides some unique insight into the deceased's mental and emotional state. And after we collect the necessary data, the next step is to analyze it systematically. We're looking for identifying patterns. We're looking for identifying contradictions and significant events that may have influenced the deceased's psychological state. We're looking for, is there a cause or evidence of psychache, of that emotional psychological pain? And one of the most critical aspects of conducting psychological autopsies then, of course, is the corroborating the findings. And this means cross-referencing the information obtained from the different sources. So, for instance, statements made by family members during an interview should be compared with medical records or personal writings in order to validate their accuracy. And the corroboration process helps us to eliminate biases and ensures that the conclusions drawn are based on solid evidence. And then we come to our conclusion and our reporting. And the final step here is to formulate our conclusion by analyzing the data and compiling a comprehensive report. And the report should clearly outline the findings, including the reconstructed psychological state of the deceased, any contributing factors to their death, and the methodology used. Now, how do we structure a psychological autopsy case? Well, in structuring a psychological autopsy, it really involves organizing all of that data in a way that really facilitates a clear understanding. We're looking for as good of an accurate narrative as we can get of understanding the deceased's life and psychological factors that might have contributed to their death. And so here's just a little bit of a step-by-step guide. First off, we want to do a background. We want to compile our background information, their demographic information, their age, gender, occupation, family background, any significant life events that they may have gone through. In this, we're also going to be looking for, was there any changes in behavior, any significant stressors or incidents that might have influenced their mental health, their mental state at a certain time. Then we're going to do a mental health history and try to document as best as possible the deceased's mental health history, including any diagnoses, any treatments, any hospitalizations, any medications. And by this, we're exploring patterns of the individual's mental health state, identifying periods of stability versus periods of crisis. We're then going to analyze their social context. What's the nature of their relationship with their family, with their friends, with their colleagues, with significant others? Who were their friends? Who were their enemies? What challenges did they have? And consider all of the factors like what kind of social support did they have? What kind of conflicts did they have? Were they isolated? Had they experienced some significant loss? Things that can contribute to psychache, like their living conditions, their financial status, their relationship status, their employment, or access to means of self-harm. We'll then take a look at their behavioral analysis. We'll conduct an analysis of what they did leading up to their death. Were there changes in their routine? Was there withdrawal from social activities? Was there alterations in work performance or other behavioral indicators of stress? Were there any notes, any evidences of suicidal intent, making a will, giving away their possessions, that sort of thing? And we'll then explore the deceased's cognitive and emotional state in the period leading up to their death. And this involves examining what were their beliefs and emotional experiences. For instance, did they have signs of hopelessness or worthlessness or pervasive sadness? We'll then do a psychological evaluation. And here we're looking at, was there an interplay between mental health disorders and cognitive and emotional factors and social influences and environmental stressors? All of these, all the things that really can align, what are the risk factors of suicide versus accidental death or other outcomes? And then from all of this, we formulate a hypothesis about the deceased's psychological state and potential motivations leading up to their death. And these hypotheses should be based on evidence collected and the psychological evaluation. And it should conclude with a reasoned determination of the manner and cause of death, supported by the data, and clearly state whether the death was likely suicide, accident, homicide, or undetermined, and the role, the rationale was for this. And with that, then we can start to have a good sense of what might have happened. Now, of course, there are a lot of things that go into this. There's the psychological factors, things like depression and anxiety, bipolar, schizophrenia, cognitive distortions, irrational beliefs, rigid thought patterns, feelings of hopelessness, guilt, self-blame. Then there's social factors, quality and stability of the relationships, conflicts, loss, changes in social support, social isolation, cultural and societal familial expectations, environmental factors like financial difficulties, legal problems, occupational stress. And what are the cognitive processes that might have gone on here? What evidence is there for making a decision about their decisions? Were their rationale, or was it rational and deliberate? Was it an impulsive decision? Was it driven by emotional distress? What were the feelings there? Were they of rejection and loss? Were they overwhelmed? What were the behavioral patterns? Was this the signs that something was planned? Was there something that was prepared? Were they putting their affairs in order, or was it impulsive? All of which can go into helping us to understand the thinking patterns of the deceased. And of course, when we're doing psychological autopsy, we want to follow best practices. One of the best practices is interviews. And in doing interviews, you want to provide you do this because you want to provide first-hand accounts of the deceased behavior, their mood changes, their relationships, their stressors, and find any more nuanced understanding of the mental state. But you need to remember that the person has died. And so the interview needs to be conducted in a very sensitive and ethical and very methodical way. So you start by conducting an interview by looking at the deceased's background. You set the context, you build rapport, you begin by expressing some empathy for their loss and acknowledging the difficulty of the situation and building trust with the person. You, in doing so, want to give them your full attention. You want to maintain eye contact. You want to be responsive in your nodding and in your verbal affirmations as you talk to the person. And as you make the person feel heard, they can then be more candid with you. And it's ideal to use open-ended questions to encourage the interviewee to really share the detailed information. So don't simply ask, was the deceased depressed? But ask something more along the lines of, can you describe any changes you noticed in their behavior or their mood in the weeks leading up to their death? Once they share some of that information, then you can probe a little bit more. But you want to avoid leading questions. Instead, you want to just probe for more information as the interview goes forward. And you want to recognize and respond to distress, like allowing a person to cry. But at the same time, you want to maintain your professional boundaries. You want to be empathetic, but you need to recognize that you are there for a purpose. And so you need to be professional when you're gathering this information and avoid being overwhelmed by the emotions. And that's just a simple self-preservation thing as well. And as you go through this process, you want to periodically summarize the interviewee's statements to ensure that what you are saying is correct. And so you can repeat back. So I understand correctly. You noticed that they were starting to withdraw from social activities about a month before their death. Is that right? And then they can kind of clarify. And as you go through this process, you can then start to corroborate that with interview information, with medical records, with other statements from interviewees. And by documenting these interviews, you do that by taking detailed notes, or if you can get permission. And with those detailed notes, you also want to highlight changes in tone or body language, because that's important, or nonverbal cues. But you also, if you can, and get permission for it, to record. And that obviously allows for a more accurate transcription, ensure that no details are missed. So you can start off by going through some fairly robust questioning. You can start off with some exploratory questions, make some open questions. Can you tell me about your relationship with the deceased? And then get into some more focused questions, like were there any significant changes, and what kind of changes might those have been? You can look at behavioral questions. Did they ever talk about feelings of hopelessness or wanting to hurt themselves? Contextual questions. What was happening in their life around the time that they started to withdraw from social activities? And in all of that, you are managing your own emotion, and you're managing to be sensitive and empathetic to those that you are interviewing. You always want to allow them the open emotional space to express their grief. And if they want a moment, it's okay for them to take a moment and collect themselves. But we are to be professional. And then, of course, we analyze all of this data. We categorize it. We organize it into different categories. And this might include interview transcripts, might include medical records, digital footprint. We try to create a chronological order so that we can trace the progression of the deceased psychological state over time, and this may reveal a pattern that's of escalating distress or significant changes in behavior. We can identify certain themes of feelings of hopelessness or isolation or relationship conflicts or financial stress. And we can code this data, and that's one of the values of doing qualitative research, is we learn how to code data into, one code might be emotional distress, another one might be interpersonal conflict. And when we have this systematically organized data, that really facilitates a deeper analysis. We can then look for patterns in this. What are the consistencies within the data? What are the trends within this data? And we can then evaluate that within context. We're contextualizing the data, consider the data. So, for example, a statement expressing hopelessness may carry different weight depending on whether it was made during a particular stressful period or in response to a specific life event. We then can cross-reference the information. We can also, of course, want to identify any inconsistencies. Is there some contradictory information? Like a close friend says, no, they were always happy. But in the writings, you find that they reveal deep despair. That is something that's significant, that brings out what you can weight within this analysis. And then you formulate your conclusions of the psychological state of the individual. And you do that by synthesizing the data, you're integrating the themes and patterns, you're constructing a psychological profile, you're formulating the hypothesis, you're developing the explanatory hypothesis, and you are really you're assessing the likelihood of different scenarios. You're evaluating the likelihood of whether the death was suicide or whether it was a homicide, whether it was an accident. And you do that by developing a good, robust psychological profile, behavioral patterns, and contextual factors. And then, of course, you write your clear and precise report. Now, I want to discuss a specific challenge that arises in each context with forensic psychology, and that is every case is a little different. And so it's crucial to understand, yes, the mental and emotional state of the deceased, but sometimes the information is limited. Sometimes they don't leave a note. Sometimes they leave lots of information and it's very complex. So there's challenges in suicidal cases. Sometimes there's ambiguity of intent. One of the primary challenges of suicide cases is determining the intent behind the death. Not all self-inflicted deaths are clear-cut. There may be ambiguity regarding whether the person intended to die or if the death was accidental. And this is particularly challenging in cases of overdose, where it may be unclear whether the overdose was intentional or unintentional. And of course, then there's the social stigma. Another challenge is the influence of accounts provided by family and friends. Interviewees may be reluctant to acknowledge signs of suicidal behavior or downplay the deceased distress due to their own shame or guilt. And it's essential for forensic psychologists to approach these interviews with sensitivity, but be aware of the potential biases and the incomplete information. So in suicide cases, the psychological autopsy can provide, ideally, closure for the deceased loved ones by offering them an explanation of the death. And it can also be used in legal contexts, such as in insurance claims, where the determination of suicide versus accidental death may affect the outcome. And of course, there is also the issue of psychological autopsies in homicide cases. And in homicide cases, if the victim here, we're focusing on understanding their intentions with their interactions with the perpetrator, their state of mind, and whether they might have been aware of or involved in the escalating tensions. And for the perpetrator, the autopsy can explore their mental health, their motives, and the psychological triggers that led to the homicide. And so here, sometimes, if you have a murder-suicide, for example, it can establish a motive or pattern of behavior that supports and starts to make sense of what went on. And oftentimes what you'll see is that there are some complex interpersonal dynamics that go on, and it's the investigator's job to untangle the psychological factors at play and recognize that some information may be misleading, and particularly in the case where the perpetrator is still alive. They may attempt to mislead the investigation by providing false or biased information about the victim. So there's a lot of things to keep in mind in all of these cases. Now, when we are writing our psychological autopsy, what do we want it to look like? Well, of course, we want it to look professional. So we start off with a title page, psychological autopsy report, the name of the deceased, the date of death, the date of the report's completion, and it, of course, should include the name of the forensic psychologist or the team that is conducting the autopsy. We then have a table of contents that provides a bit of an overview of the report structure and allows the readers to easily navigate the different sections. We then have an executive summary, and the executive summary provides a brief overview of the report, including the purpose of the psychological autopsy, the key findings, and the main conclusions. And this section should be concise, usually no more than a page, and written in a way that allows readers to quickly grasp the essence of the report without having to read the entire document, because quite honestly, most people are just going to read the executive summary. It's the researchers or those that have a deep personal vested interest that are going to read the rest. But it's still important to have the rest of the document. The rest of the document is our introduction that has a section that should outline the scope of the autopsy, including specific questions that were addressed. So like, were we determining the deceased psychological state and potential motives for their death? We then give some background information, basics like demographic information, their age, gender, occupation, marital status, other relationship information, their medical and psychiatric history, their social and family backgrounds, the key timelines, also very important to provide there. Then we have our methodology. What data did we collect? How did we analyze that data? How did we organize it? And typically there's going to be a section in there that talks about emotional distress and social isolation and behavioral changes and cognitive distortions. And that leads to our hypothesis and conclusions section that is going to help us to work through the logic of what kind of conclusion did we come to and why did we come to that conclusion. From there, though, we want to learn some lessons. And there's usually lessons to be learned. So we're going to have a recommendation section in there that helps us to suggest things to look for further investigations, for other or advice for the deceased family or for public health intervention. We'll then have a list of references for, say, for example, medical records, legal documents, academic literature that helps inform our research and our decisions. And really, the intention here is that it be clear and precise and objective and professional. And if visual aids are able to be put in there, like timelines, charts, diagrams, great. Those are very helpful. And this will then help for testimony if that is required within court. So, as we close out, I want to highlight 3 key terms and our question for the week. So, what is a psychological autopsy? Well, that is an investigative process carried out by a person after a person's death to reconstruct the psychological state at the time of death. And this involves gathering and analyzing information from many sources, from family and friends and digital communications and personal writings and medical records and school records and employment records. And the primary goal is to understand the mental and emotional factors that might have contributed to the individual's death. What is a thematic analysis? Well, we've talked about what a thematic analysis is, but to be a little more clear, a thematic analysis is a research method used to identify and analyze and report patterns or themes within qualitative data. And in psychological autopsies, this process involves coding or categorizing data from sources such as interviews and personal writings and medical records to uncover recurring themes that shed light on the deceased's psychological statement and the circumstances leading to their death. And when we talk about corroboration, what are we talking about? Well, we're talking about what confirms, what validates that data. How can we cross-reference multiple sources? And so, because in a psychological autopsy, this means comparing accounts from interviews, from medical records, and from forms of evidence, whatever they might be, to ensure that there is consistency and reliability in the findings. And so when we ask the question, what's the best phrase to really describe the purpose of a psychological autopsy? Well, I would say that the best description based upon this lecture would be to investigate the psychological state of an individual before their death. So, whatever you find yourself doing, I hope that you understand that there are a lot of things that go into it. That deaths oftentimes are ambiguous, and it can be very difficult to delineate between what the cause might have been. And so it takes the time and the effort of a forensic psychologist or investigator to do a good, clear psychological autopsy to bring some sense of understanding or closure, both to the legal system, to insurance, as well as to the family and the community. Hope you enjoyed this lecture. Hope you found it informative, and I will see you next week. You take care. Bye-bye.